On a sweltering afternoon in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso lay still under the weight of the dry Sahel sun. Inside the presidential palace, the usually bustling halls were quiet. Most staff had already departed for the day. But in a corner office lined with faded colonial woodwork and aging furniture, President Ibrahim Traoré sat alone, his eyes fixed on a dusty file that had just landed on his desk. The file, weathered and brittle, had been found hours earlier during routine renovations of the old National Treasury room. Behind a long-forgotten wall panel, workers had uncovered a sealed metal box, rusted at the edges, but clearly protected with intention. "Mr. President," his aide had said, hesitant, "the workers believe, you need to see this immediately." Now, as a ceiling fan rotated slowly above him, casting rhythmic shadows over the paper-strewn desk, Traoré opened the file with care. Inside, amid old administrative papers and faded documents, was a single sheet that instantly seized his attention, a hand-drawn map of Burkina Faso. But this was no ordinary map. Marked across the northern regions were gold deposits, vast, dense, and entirely absent from any official geological record. There were handwritten notes in the margins, signed and sealed by none other than Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary president assassinated in 1987. One line stood out: "This is our true power." Their knowledge of it would be the end of our freedom. When the time is right, when a leader of courage emerges, this will be our path to true independence. Traoré leaned back, the weight of history pressing against his chest. If this map was accurate, it wasn't just a forgotten piece of paper. It was a key to national transformation. It was also a threat, one that might explain assassinations, foreign interventions, and decades of quiet manipulation. He realized something profound. Buried under his nation's soil was not just gold, but a truth powerful enough to liberate, or destroy. President Traoré carefully unfolded the fragile document, laying it across the full width of his desk. The map's details were intricate, hand-drawn geological markings, coded annotations, and ink faded by time but still legible. It was clear this was no ordinary relic. The handwriting along the borders, bold, deliberate, bore the unmistakable style of Thomas Sankara, a man revered as the nation's most courageous, and perhaps most dangerous, visionary. One sentence struck Traoré with chilling clarity: "Knowledge of this is our liberation. Knowledge of this is also our undoing." There were markings indicating deposits in the Jibo region, the Gurma Mountains, and zones long labeled by Western-backed institutions as inaccessible due to insecurity. Yet there was no mention of these locations in any modern geological survey. Traoré's thoughts raced. How could a secret of this magnitude remain hidden for decades? More importantly, who had kept it buried, and why? The file also included a memorandum addressed to the future leader of Burkina Faso, handwritten in 1986. Sankara's words spoke directly to the moment Traoré now found himself in. "If you are reading this, then I did not live long enough to complete what I began. I have seen the maps. I know what lies beneath. But power is never surrendered willingly, especially by those who built empires on our backs. Guard this secret until you are ready. When we reclaim our resources, we reclaim our future." For years, Traoré had studied Sankara's ideology: self-reliance, anti-imperialism, sovereignty through dignity, but never imagined he would be the one to uncover the physical legacy his predecessor had tried to protect. It was no longer theory or idealism. It was tangible. It was real. And it was dangerous. His mind shifted from inspiration to logistics. If the information was accurate, and Sankara was never one for exaggeration, Burkina Faso's gold reserves were at least triple the official estimate. That alone could explain decades of international manipulation, the predatory contracts, sudden coups, the inexplicable foreign military presence in the north. Then, the real question struck him: if I know this now, who else does? He stood from his chair, moved to the window, and looked out at the capital shimmering in the dusk. Behind every mining deal, every aid agreement, every security collaboration, was a hidden war for control. The discovery was not just a blessing. It was a line in the sand. And crossing it would change everything. 3 days later, before the first light touched the rooftops of Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré slipped through a side entrance of the presidential residence. Dressed in plain clothes, a worn shirt, jeans, and a cap pulled low over his brow, he could have passed for any young Burkinabe. But the weight in his steps was not that of an ordinary man. It was the weight of a nation's future, and of secrets too dangerous to share. Waiting for him in a nondescript SUV was his most trusted team, Yakuba Wedrao, his loyal economic advisor, Dr. Zeta, a seasoned geologist with no ties to Western mining companies, and 2 military officers in civilian clothing, Captain Saadou and Lieutenant Ouya. The mission was simple in concept but perilous in execution: reach the Jibo region, test the soil, and confirm if Sankara's map had been truthful. "All preparations are complete, Mr. President," Wedrao said as the vehicle eased away from the palace gates. "Your absence has been covered. Officially, you're recovering from illness. Only the Prime Minister knows you're not in the capital." Traore nodded, his eyes scanning the silent city streets. No motorcades. No security details. No signals. The SUV avoided main roads, instead taking meandering rural routes to avoid checkpoints, especially those manned by troops with French advisors. As the urban sprawl gave way to open savanna and then to the dry, unforgiving terrain of the north, the air grew thick, not just with heat, but with tension. Jibo had long been designated a security risk zone by international agencies. Western governments cited extremist threats, discouraging travel. But as they passed through neglected villages and dusty crossroads, Traore saw something different. These were not terrorist strongholds, they were communities forgotten by their own government, served more by foreign soldiers than by national infrastructure. Captain Saadou muttered as they passed a settlement of makeshift homes and parched fields, "These people see more French uniforms than Burkinabe ones." By mid-afternoon, they reached the coordinates on the map. A seemingly insignificant patch of land, dry and rocky, surrounded by low hills. It looked like any other landscape across the Sahel. But according to Sankara's map, it was the heart of buried wealth. "This is it," Dr. Zeta confirmed, checking his GPS and map overlay. "The coordinates match exactly." They parked beneath a rock outcropping, setting up camp disguised as a basic geological survey, common enough to avoid suspicion, at least for now. As Dr. Zeta began unpacking instruments and collecting samples, the others kept watch. Every sound of wind or engine put them on edge. They knew that if the gold was real, danger was already on its way. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain, a dust cloud appeared in the distance, signaling the approach of a vehicle. Captain Saadou raised his binoculars. "Old pickup. 2 passengers. Local plates," he reported, voice low but alert. The group tensed. Hands moved discreetly toward concealed weapons, though no one drew. The pickup came to a halt about 50 meters away. From it stepped an elderly man with a wooden staff, followed by a younger man who appeared to be his grandson. The old man's voice rang out in flawless Moor, the local language. "Visitors are rare in these parts, especially important visitors disguised as ordinary men." Traore's eyes narrowed. Despite his plain attire, the man had identified him. He stepped forward cautiously, responding in Moor, "We're conducting a geological survey." The elder smiled, his missing teeth revealing age, but not weakness. "The president of Burkina Faso does not come here in secret for routine surveys," he replied. "You came for what lies beneath. For what was hidden from your people for generations." Silence fell. The stranger's words were too precise, too knowing. Traore made a decision. "Who are you?" "My name is Bationo," the man said. "My grandfather was a spiritual guide during the French occupation. You need to hear what was buried with the gold." Despite protests from his security officers, Traore agreed to follow the man to a nearby village. There, elders were already gathered, as if expecting them. A meal was prepared, and without protocol or ceremony, Traore was seated at the place of honor. As night fell and oil lamps flickered to life, Bationo spoke. "The French found gold here in 1953, he began. It was so vast, they called it the mother lode. But colonial powers do not make colonies rich. They steal, then cover their tracks." He told the story of Duval, a French geologist who had married a local woman and grown close to the community. Moved by conscience, Duval secretly documented the full extent of the deposits and gave maps to trusted village elders. After independence, those maps were shared with Sankara, Burkina Faso's only leader who dared plan a national gold initiative. He was assassinated before he could act. "Our elders have waited since then," Bationo said, his eyes fixed on Traore. "For a leader who would use this knowledge not for personal gain, but for the true liberation of our people." At that moment, Dr. Zeta approached with wide eyes. "Mr. President, the tests confirm it. The gold levels here are extraordinary. If it holds across the region, this may be one of the largest deposits in Africa." Traore absorbed the words in silence. The legend was no longer just oral history. It was science. And it was alive. The camp buzzed with quiet urgency. Dr. Zeta moved quickly between equipment cases, his flashlight beam flickering across sample trays. "High-grade ore," he muttered to himself. "Concentration far beyond average West African fields." President Traore stood nearby, watching as the geologist double-checked his readings. When Zeta finally turned to him, his eyes were glowing with restrained excitement. "Mr. President, if these results are consistent across the zones marked on Sankara's map, we're sitting on one of Africa's richest gold reserves. Undocumented. Untouched." Before Traore could reply, Captain Saadou came sprinting in from the edge of the camp. "Sir, we're picking up encrypted radio traffic," he said, breathless. "French special forces are mobilizing from their base in Ouagadougou. Code phrases reference a suspected terrorist presence in this exact region." A cold wave passed through the group. "That can't be coincidence," said Wedrao. "We have a leak." Traore clenched his jaw. The secrecy of their mission had been compromised. He had suspected infiltration in the palace, but not this fast. Someone tracked our movement. Or accessed communications. Bationo, the old village elder, raised a hand. "There is another way," he said quietly. "Paths the French do not know. Trails older than their maps." Without further hesitation, the group began dismantling the camp. Zeta secured his samples, Saadou and Ouya prepared weapons, and Bationo's grandson took the lead, guiding them through a network of footpaths invisible to satellite eyes and helicopters. Behind them, the unmistakable thump of rotor blades grew louder. Hours later, hidden in ravines and dense acacia groves, the group slipped silently through the terrain, watching as military choppers hovered above the very village they had just left. That night, under the cover of darkness and local guidance, they traveled by foot and by borrowed motorcycle, reaching a quiet farming outpost just outside Ouagadougou before dawn. A trusted cabinet minister waited there with an unmarked vehicle, and by mid-morning, Traore re-entered the presidential palace through a service entrance. The official narrative released that day stated French special forces had disrupted a terrorist meeting in the north. No mention of geology. No mention of gold. But inside the palace, Traoré's inner circle met in a secured room, swept for bugs, guarded at every door. He spread Sankara's map on the table. "We now have proof," he said quietly. "The gold is real. So is the foreign interference. And we have a traitor in our ranks." Everyone in the room understood what would come next. And no one, least of all the president, was going to wait for permission. Ban ko dong y voi noi dung qua fan nai kong. Toi si chi teep tuc kai ban zak nan. Ban da noi. Zak nan. Chat gpt da noi. Tuet voi. Toi si teep tuc voi task 6, body v, confrontation with France and public declaration, voi du dai koang 400 to 502. Writing hand task 6, body v, confrontation with France and public declaration. The next morning, the French ambassador, Jean-Michel Durand, arrived at the presidential palace expecting a routine diplomatic briefing. Instead, he was ushered into a secure chamber, face-to-face with President Traoré and a row of stern-faced military officers. "Ambassador Durand," Traoré began, his tone icy, "perhaps you can explain why French special forces launched an operation in the Jibo region, precisely where I happened to be conducting a confidential state visit." Durand didn't flinch, but his gaze narrowed. "Counter-terrorism operations, Mr. President. Part of our ongoing security partnership." Traoré slid a folder across the table. Inside were intercepted communications between the French embassy in Paris, coded language referencing geological targets, covert extraction plans, and preemptive operations in the north. The ambassador's jaw tightened. "Also," Traoré continued, "perhaps you can explain these payment logs, monthly wire transfers to Deputy Minister of Mines Macho Kayor." As if on cue, the door opened. Kayor entered, escorted by security, head bowed. He had confessed everything: classified documents passed to French intelligence, meetings in secret cafés, promises of asylum and wealth. Durand adjusted his tie. "Mr. President, I suggest we discuss this diplomatically. Our nations—" "Yes," Traoré cut him off, "our nations have a long-standing relationship. One where we bleed, and you benefit. That ends today." An hour later, Traoré stood before a camera in a room draped with the flag of Burkina Faso, red for revolution, green for abundance, yellow for the wealth they were no longer willing to give away. "My fellow citizens," he began, "for too long, we have been told that we are poor. That we must borrow to survive. That we must surrender our land in exchange for aid. But today, I tell you the truth." He held up Sankara's map. "Buried beneath our soil is gold, 3 times the amount recorded in official accounts. This is not fiction. It has been confirmed. And it belongs to us." He announced the National Resource Sovereignty Initiative, a declaration that all undocumented mineral reserves were now national treasures, under direct state control. Foreign mining without fair partnership would be banned. Leaked French documents and intelligence cables were uploaded online in real time. Across the country, shock gave way to euphoria. Across the Western world, rage simmered. Sanctions were imposed. Loans frozen. Headlines branded Traoré as a nationalist, a destabilizer. But in that moment, Burkina Faso had chosen truth over fear. And the world was watching. 6 months later, under the hot Sahel sun, a new chapter was being written, not in the language of aid or dependency, but in the language of self-determination. In the hills of the Jibo region, Burkinabe engineers and geologists stood shoulder to shoulder, overseeing the first extraction of gold, by Burkinabe hands, with Burkinabe tools, for Burkinabe futures. The results were staggering. The purity and quantity exceeded even the boldest predictions. President Traore had already established a sovereign wealth fund. 70% of all revenue earmarked for schools, hospitals, water systems, and roads. The rest went to national defense and infrastructure to protect what had so long been stolen. In the very village where he had once sat by lantern light with Elder Bationo, Traore ordered the construction of the country's most advanced technical college, dedicated to geology, mining engineering, and resource management. Bationo had passed away just 2 months after the announcement. But his grandson, the same young man who had guided them through the ancient trails that night, became one of the college's first students. When Traore visited the site a year later, he watched the young man oversee a team of students testing soil samples. "My grandfather didn't live to see this," the student said, "but he always believed it would come. He said the true treasure wasn't just the gold, but the courage to claim it." Traore smiled, looking out over the dusty horizon where the mines glinted under sunlight. "Your grandfather was right," he said. "The gold was always here. We just had to believe we were worthy of it." As the sun set behind the Jibo mountains, casting golden rays across a land no longer silent, one truth shone brighter than any mineral: the greatest national treasure was not what lay beneath the soil, but what had risen in the hearts of the people. A belief in sovereignty, in dignity, in the power of a nation to choose its own future.